In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to combat cable flare at the cast on and bind off edges of cabled fabrics. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. Cable flare is something that you can see along the edges of fabric when there is a difference in gauge between what's at the edge of the fabric and the area that's cabled, where all the cable crossings occur. So right here you can see I have cable crossings right at that transition from the border and the cabled area, and I have kind of this gathered area looking here, and I have seed stitch border that flares a bit right here, but there's a lot of rippling. And then in this swatch, what you'll see is I have garter stitch all the way around, and the fabric is flaring outwardly. It's not as much ribbling because the cable crosses are further from the transition point, but because of the way that garter stitch compresses and stretches vertically, this flaring has really caused the garter stitch to compress, and it just sort of exacerbates it. So this actually ends up looking a lot wider than this example, but here you have all of this rippling. So in both cases, this is an example of something that you probably wouldn't want in your finished garment. There are a few ways of combating cable flare, and depending on the particular scenario that your project falls into. So in some situations, cables go all the way to the edge of the fabric. There's no border below it. There's just the columns of stitches that are going to be the cables, and that's it. So if you wait to make your first cable crossings until you're quite a ways away from the edge, and if you do your last cable crossing while you're quite a ways away from the bind off edge, in both cases you're going to get some flaring. Now this flaring isn't terrible, but it doesn't look great. So here what I've done instead is I've moved the cable crossings. I did the first cable crossing right within a row or two of casting on, and then I made sure that I did my final crossing right before I bound off. So in this case, I actually only worked a couple of more rows in order to get that first and last crossing right at the edge, but I end up with more ropes in the result than I had in this one. And here it looks like I have kind of two ropes and then a couple of long tails, and here the ropes are going all the way up. And again, it's just a couple rows more in length, so you can adjust the length a little bit in order to get a better result. And notice that in both cases, these cables are vertically symmetrical. If you are crossing cables, say every 8 rows, and your cable crossing says to work 7 rows and then cross on the 8th row, you certainly wouldn't want to wait until the 8th row to cross here and have all this excessive amount. And then you even more certainly wouldn't want to do the final crossing right before the end. That would create a fabric that was not symmetrical vertically, in addition to causing one of the edges to flare. Just wouldn't look good. So you always want to have vertically symmetrical cabling in a situation where you're working in a rectangle like this. And then you want to do your first and last cable crossings as close to the edge as you can. Here's a similar scenario, but in this case I've got a horizontal border above and below. And again, I was crossing pretty far away from that transition point, and this caused the fabric to really flare and the edges to pull in. This is this exact same cabling that I did in this swatch, but with a garter stitch border, and you can see how more dramatic the flaring is in this case. If I were to make the change where I created the crossings right at the transition points, I wouldn't eliminate the cable flare. I would instead end up with something like this, where I would have minimized the flare at the edges, but I'd end up with these rippling. So let's look at what we need to do to eliminate this type of flaring in either case. Here's a swatch where I did cross right at the transition points, and you can see there's no flaring, but there's no flaring because I changed the number of stitches that I was using when I cast on, and then I increased in the final row right before I started doing cable crossings. So it isn't just a matter of where you begin and end your cable crossings, it's also a matter of addressing the difference in gauge between the border pattern and the cabled area. So let's say I wanted to knit a scarf that had this cable up the center, and I wanted it to be flanked on either side by a rope cable like this. I'm going to use the same rope cable on both sides. Now I could swatch this with the cable on either side if I wanted, or because I was going to be using this cable more than once, I could just measure how wide this cable is and then double that so that I would know how much wider this cabled area is going to be than what it is on this swatch. Over here, I've added enough additional stitches that I can get a stitch gauge, an actual stitch gauge for seed stitch, because the difference between calculating gauge for cables like this and calculating gauge for a stitch pattern like this is that for this type of pattern you're looking at stitches per inch, because you can add as many stitches as you need of this particular stitch pattern or take away as many as you need to get any given width. But with the cables, you're going to be using this exact number of stitches, and it's more informative to know actually how wide these cables are. So when you figure out how wide your entire cable section is going to be, then you use the stitch gauge of the seed stitch to figure out how many seed stitches are in something that's that wide. So here's a swatch where I actually did that. I used the information I got from this swatch by measuring how wide this is and then adding enough more of the cable plus the column of purl stitches that are next to it, adding that to the width that I have here to get the total width that this was going to be. And then once I knew how wide this was going to be, I used the stitch gauge of this seed stitch portion to calculate how many seed stitches would be right here. So the edge borders are going to be the same stitches no matter what, but the number of seed stitches that I need in between here are going to be significantly less than the number of stitches that I need in this section here. So I'm going to cast on the number of seed stitches I need to work all the way across, and then right before I start working the cables, I'm going to do enough increases in this area. I'm not going to do any increases in the borders. I'm going to do enough increases in here to give me the stitch count I need to work the cabled area. And then as I start the seed stitch border at the end, I'm going to be decreasing all of those stitches out. So that's the same thing I did here, only with garter stitch. I calculated my garter stitch gauge and figured out how many garter stitches I needed, and then I did increases to increase to the number of stitches I needed for the cabled area. Well, there's the third scenario, and that scenario is when you need to start your cable crossings further from the edge, but you can't do any increases. So that's the case. This is a swatch where I have reversible cables, and I wanted to start the ribbing pattern and the garter stitch columns that separate the cable panels. I wanted to start them earlier and then move into the cabled area. And because this area here isn't cabled, again, I get this cable flare and I can't reduce the number of stitches here. So what I can do in this case is use a smaller needle. So I used a needle that was a couple of sizes smaller. You can still see there's a little bit of flare here, but I used a needle that was a couple of sizes smaller for the area leading up to the cables, and then I switched to a larger needle when I started doing the cables. Using the smaller needle can also be something that might work for you when you have to do when you have a situation like this where you have a significantly smaller number of stitches that you're using for the border and you need to do a lot of increases. You could use a smaller needle for this border area right here, and then not only do your increases but switch to the larger needle. So here's that same reversible cable pattern again, but with a shorter lead up to the first cable crossing. This reduces the number of rows before I start doing the crossing. and I used a smaller needle, and that was sufficient to prevent the fabric from flaring. Different scenarios require different strategies for combating cable flare, and sometimes it's helpful to combine strategies. If you're knitting a pattern and you see signs of cable flare in the pattern photos, it's probable that the designer did not take measures to combat cable flare. You can then use the strategies shown in this video to create a project that is cable flare free. You can also use these strategies when designing your own cabled projects. If you'd like written material regarding how to deal with the gauge differences between the border pattern and the cabled section, I've included a link down in the description to an article I wrote for Interweave Knits 2018 issue. Many of the swatches shown in today's video appear in that article, and all the calculations are presented in the article as well. If you find my technique videos helpful and you'd like to thank me, you can buy me a coffee on Ko-fi.com. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.